No, I think we're good to go. I'm good. How are you today? I mean, we're not. You went right in the room. Well, someone's got to throw the room side. We say inclusion, this is not what we're talking about. Oh, yes. All right. Got a suit up here. Yeah. Sure. Let's do a test. I'm speaking into the microphone now. We'll find out if the technology works. Just one question I meant to ask you. In terms of where I stand, does it make any difference? Not really? Got about 100 feet that you can walk. Okay. All right. And as far as what's being picked up and broadcast over Zoom, it's just that, right? It's the whole screen. Yeah, but it's not like a camera shot of the room or anything like that. It's just that. No way to, well, to
To do both, I would have to have a camera pointing that way.
It hardly seems worth it. Do you think we should start more or less on time, or give everybody a couple of minutes to sign in? I'll give them a couple minutes. Well, since it got very quiet, I think maybe it's time for us to start. Good morning, everyone. So good to see you here. My name is David Corbell. I think we all know each other in the room. Thank you so much for joining us today for some discussion about the university and its planning and its priorities going forward. My welcome is both to the folks in the room here and also to others who might be joining us via Zoom. We're glad to have them with us also. Now, you might notice that we're trying out some new technology this morning that we've never used before in quite this way, but it'll be an interesting experiment. And if it works the way we hope it will, it'll help us make this meeting more accessible to everyone. As most of you know, Emporia State University has a 10-year strategic plan. This plan is between 4 and 5 years old now. And in these 4 to 5 years, we have made a tremendous amount of progress on the goals and objectives. We have worked pretty hard to assess the progress we've made. We've documented it pretty carefully, and we actually feel pretty good about it. However, what happens in those 5 years is that the environment around us keeps on changing, even though the plan is in place. So since we're close to the midpoint of the lifespan of the plan, it just seemed like a good time to review where we are and think a little more carefully about what happens next. Next slide, please. Now, last fall, President Garrett appointed a strategic plan review committee. Several of the members of that committee are with us here this morning. Tonya Bauman from the School of Business is over here, Myra Dow from Library and Information Management, Amy Sage Webb from Liberal Arts and Sciences. Michael Webb is here representing Associated Student Government. Lynn Hobson from Student Affairs. Shane Shively from the Foundation. Have I missed anyone else? Oh, Angela Walgram from Administration and Finance. And Galen Wolf-Bordnaro is here from the Teachers College. Gosh, I think we have just about the whole committee here. Thank you for being with us. The President gave us the charge that you see here on the screen. Take a second, please, to look at that charge. Now, that's pretty simple, isn't it? Very basic. Look at the goals. Look at the objectives. See if they're still current and viable. That's it. Now, you'll notice that the charge was not to go and write a new strategic plan. That's not what this review process is about. This is a possible update. It's really not a replacement at all. The other thing I'd like for you to be aware of and keep in mind is that every part of the university has developed its own strategies to support these goals and objectives. Now, it's the strategies where the real work happens. That's where the good stuff is. But this review process that we're in the midst of right now is not about those unit strategies. It only applies to the 5 goals and the objectives under them that apply to the entire university. Next slide, please. So how did this committee go about its work? Well, we started by having a series of meetings with various individuals around the university who have some responsibility for some part of the plan. We talked with deans and directors, folks from student affairs, from advancement. We talked with representatives from the Diversity and Inclusion Alliance. But in all of these conversations, we used the same three questions. They're the ones you see on the screen here. Is the goal still relevant? Are the objectives still priorities? And then the third one was kind of interesting too. What has happened in the last 5 years? What new opportunities have come along that might have an impact on what we would want to do going forward? The conversations we had with all these individuals using these three questions have really informed the strategies, or excuse me, the suggestions that we're going to be sharing with you today. So what we would like to do with our time is take you through our suggestions a little bit at a time, provide some time for conversation and questions, and simply see what you think about what we're suggesting. I do ask you to keep in mind, these suggestions right now are just ideas. Nothing is final, and that's the reason why we need your input at this particular stage. Now, I think all of you may have received a handout as you came in. I do want you to know that what you see on your handout is the very same information that you're going to be seeing on the screen here, but the handout just makes it a little bit easier to see at a glance how the whole thing looks. So hopefully between the two resources, it'll be a little bit more understandable. Before we dive into the committee's suggestions, do you have any questions about what I've told you so far? Seeing no hands go up, we'll go ahead and get started. Next slide, please. You may notice we're starting at the end, not at the beginning. We would like to start with Goal 5. The reason is that Goal 5 presents kind of a unique challenge. So a little bit of history for those of you who might not have been a part of this as it happened. The Diversity and Inclusion Plan, DEIP, was actually developed a good 2 years after the strategic plan. It was a completely separate initiative. It was only then added to the strategic plan after the fact. It was simply appended to the end of the strategic plan, which originally had 4 goals. It was appended as Goal 5. Now, I tell you that because it helps to explain why Goal 5 has always read differently from the rest of the plan. It just has a different structure, a different language. It wasn't necessarily created with strategic planning in mind. So what the committee has tried to do with the suggestions for Goal 5 is, on the one hand, to absolutely preserve the intent of Goal 5, but at the same time, to make it fit a little bit better with the rest of the strategic plan. So here's what we have. If you look at the goal itself, no change. Become a model for diversity, equity, and inclusion. If you look at Objective 1, no change. Well, we're calling it an objective, but that's just, again, to make it fit the rest of the plan. Objective 2 is brand new. It was not there before. If you look at what it says, I think you can see what we're getting at and why. Accessibility was not nearly as much on our minds 5 years ago as it is today, but it's very important. It's an aspect of diversity, equity, and inclusion that the committee simply felt should be there. Let me pause and see if there are any questions or comments about what you've seen so far? All right, let's go ahead to the next slide then. We're still continuing with goal 5. Now with objective 3, you see a lot of strikeout language there, right? The idea here is simply to use fewer words and be more direct in the language so as to fit the rest of the strategic plan. However, don't worry, the strikeout language, make a mental note. You're going to see that language reappear later when we get to goal 1. The old DEIP goal 3, you'll see that one is stricken entirely. There's a reason for that. The committee felt that this did not need to be there as a separate objective. We have not actually developed learning communities yet at ESU. There's a possibility we will in the future. But if we do, the thinking is that fits very nicely under the previous objective, objective 3. Questions or comments about that? Hearing none. Next slide. We're still on goal 5. You'll see that the old DEIP goal 4 is stricken in its entirety. Here's why. In a strategic plan, you don't need to say that you're going to assess your outcomes. You just do it. It's a given with strategic planning. So we just didn't feel that now that goal 5 is a part of the strategic plan, you need to have a separate objective that says, yes, we're going to assess. Any questions or thoughts about what you see on that slide? Oh, and what I meant to emphasize at the beginning, please, members of the committee, if you notice things that you think are really important that need to be said that I am not saying, please jump in and help out, okay? Well, that completes our recommendations, or our suggestions rather, for goal 5. So at this point, let's move on to the next slide. And this flips us back around now to the beginning with goal 1. First thing I will draw to your attention, you'll see that that strikeout language in the goal itself about fostering vibrant communities, never fear, that's not really going away. In just a minute, you're going to see it reappearing in the objectives underneath goal 1. Objective 3 is new. It was not in the original strategic plan. Back in 2013, 14, 15, we were starting to talk a little bit about high impact learning experiences. But what has happened since then is that it has become a major defining theme of the university. That's the reason why the committee felt it was high time that it be stated as such in the strategic plan. Any questions about what you've seen there on that slide? All right, let's go on to the next one. Now we're still with goal 1, just continuing. Here on this slide, you see 3 brand new objectives. All 3 of them are new. They all represent new opportunities. And all 3 of them came out of conversations with President Garrett. The first one that's stated here as objective 4, it's about the environment, natural resources, and more specifically, water. You've probably all seen what's going up across the interstate from us. The Profit Center, aquatic research and outreach. A lot of opportunities there. Objective 5, technology. Objective 6, health and healthcare. What are your thoughts? Pretend water. I'm not, is there a good reason for that? Probably not. Yeah, the quotes probably confuse more than anything. Good point. I saw another hand. Same thing. Yes, Jose. Lots of conversation among the committee. Who would like to take that on? All right, I'll give it a try. With a lot of these new objectives, part of what we grappled with is how broad do you want to be, or how narrow in focus do you want to be? You can say simply that the theme is the environment. Well, that's huge. Some would say that's almost too big to do anything with, right? Well, okay, you could narrow it down somewhat and say, I don't know, natural resources, you know, that perhaps give us a bit more focus, or you could go even further and say water. So part of it is a choice about how focused you want to be. The other thing I recall from the conversations is that with the Aquatic Research Center, we've already got a kind of focus happening with water. Some of the discussion among the deans was that that theme of water does provide some opportunities for things outside the sciences. You could deal with the economics of water. You could create teaching modules for the schools around the impact of water. It's something that in the state of Kansas and elsewhere is a huge concern right now with that aquifer drying up over there. Any other thoughts about the conversations? Amy? I'm going to try to remember to do a little bit of summarizing for the technology for the benefit of the folks who are not here in the room with us. Amy Sage-Webb made the point that the overall thinking had to do with sustainability, which you will see popping up a little bit later as we do this. And then coming down to the level of water, that seemed to be something, I believe Amy's point was that that is very much applicable to the context of Goal 1, where we're talking about curricula and programs. The feeling was you could really do something with water in that context. Did that get the main points you were making, Amy? Distinctiveness. Thank you, Mark. Yes. Yes. Other questions or comments about anything you see on this slide with these three new strategic themes? If not, let's move ahead then to the next slide. Here we have two more new objectives under Goal 1. Let me give you just a second to take a look at those and think about them. Objective 7, I hope speaks for itself. Objective 8, I'll simply point out that, you know, that strikeout language we saw from Goal 5, from the diversity, equity, and inclusion language, here's where it reappears. And the thinking here is that that language and what it implies can apply very nicely in the context of curricula and programs. It's, in a sense, an effort to take the ideals of Goal 5, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and embed them throughout the rest of the plan in appropriate places. Questions or comments about this slide? Oh, yes, Heidi.
I have a question about Objective 7. I understand continuing discussions about open education that are happening nationwide. But I wonder if the objective is to support open education resources or to promote educational access to facilitate curricular innovation. So I have a couple classes where I have developed a set of materials that I'm reading. I don't use textbooks, so they are essentially free to the students. There's no cost to students except unless they want to print them out. I think that's educational access. I think there's curricular innovation there because the sources are developed in very clear ways. But it's not open education resources because they're not found on those sites. They're not put out there on those sites. It would not meet this objective. And so the question is it just that we're interested in open educational resources? Or are we interested in that last portion? What is the objective? And is the board too limited if the last part is our objective?
I'll see if I can summarize that a little bit, and please monitor me, Heidi, and see if I get it essentially correct. I think Heidi's question, in essence, was, which is it that's really important here? Is it open educational resources, or is it innovations that actually promote access and facilitate innovation? And I think the example that you used would be educational materials that you have developed that are not necessarily made available widely on any kind of digital platform, right? But that still absolutely promote access. Did I get it about right? Okay, thank you for that question. Who would like to answer it? Amy.
And I understand it is a good strategy, but is it the only strategy to achieve that objective?
So it's partly a question about which comes first and where the emphasis is, okay? I find myself wondering if there isn't at least a little bit of a challenge around what the definition is of open educational resources. You know, it's entirely possible that we don't all have the same understanding about what that means. That's true, which implies something, the fact that it's capitalized, right? What is the definition? What does open educational resources mean? Oh, surely someone will take that on. Michael Webb.
Throughout this last year, Campus Board of Student Advisory Committee has really been working to research open educational resources and accessibility of those resources. our course material.
Michael, if I attempt to take what you just said and boil it down to a few words, see if this does the trick. It sounded like you were telling us that the essential aspects of open educational resources are that they're free or low cost, and they're widely available to everyone. Is that essentially correct as you understand it?
Yes, and there are different websites that have open source materials that are OER, and there are some that you have to pay for those access to that website. And then one thing that I think is important that we're holding our discussion, you guys also the authorship and what that looks like.
Tonya Bauman. So the importance then of honoring the concept and using it as best we can, but understanding that there are related questions about quality, the authorship of the materials, and a lot of other things that have to be taken into consideration. Other thoughts? Well, thank you. Heidi, your question has given us some things to think about. Yeah. Yeah, Heidi emphasized that she's not in any way saying she's opposed to OER. Her question is about where the emphasis is and how broadly we want to make the effort. Thank you. Other thoughts about this slide before we go on? Next slide, please. All right, now we're on goal 2. There is only one slide for goal 2 because in terms of the number of words, goal 2 is the smallest one. Just a comment about the strikeout and replacement language in the goal itself. Back in 2013, 14, 15, our relationship with the Kansas Leadership Center was still in its early stages. Since that time, a lot has happened with that relationship. And the language change that's suggested here is just intended to acknowledge that we've come to a point where KLC is really the principal leadership framework that we use here at ESU. Objective 3, you'll see, is a brand new one. The thinking here might be obvious if you connect it to Objective 1 and 2 before it. The thinking is if it's important to develop the leadership capacity of students, well, then why not faculty and staff and administrators as well? Thoughts or questions about this slide? Jim Williams?
On Objective 2, so I
So the suggestion there is that for objective 2, it's not just integrating the competencies into the co-curriculum. There's still the need to develop, because it is a teaching role that's taking place there. Is that pretty close, Jim? Tonya?
I would say you're correct, except you put your expand to be just.
Tonya points out that the word develop is in the goal itself. Jim acknowledges that, but says, still, if you look at the objectives, objective 1 is expand, objective 2, he thinks development should be there. Shelley. The question is, if you look at what's stated now in the goal, as it's suggested that we revise it, and then look down at objective 3, does that mean then that KLC is what we use, period, to develop those leadership capacities? That's basically the question, Shelley? Well, consistent with, Mark says. Committee members, what do you think? Well, you know, I would personally tend to hedge a little bit by pointing out that what we say in a strategic plan is not everything we do. You know, we shine the light on certain things that we want to focus on. And so to me, it does not imply that any leadership framework that's used here outside of KLC just doesn't count. Shelley? So the possibility mentioned there is, well, if that's the case, then maybe KLC is an important strategy, but maybe it doesn't have to be stated as the goal. Is that about right, Shelley?
Okay. All right.
Tonya?
You got us, sir. All right. Happy to help. Oh, yes. Yes. Okay. Give me the chair.
So then if KLC's framework provides some pillars that we could develop leadership training around, it's worth stating there, but it doesn't necessarily imply exclusivity. Okay?
I have it on Zoom in the background of what I'm doing. Right? Yeah, it's like, oh, Jim Williams has a question. Let's hear that now. Okay, come on. Exactly.
The conversation just then was whether calling out KLC in the goal itself
The database is always slow.
still allows some room, or whether it starts to feel restrictive and
It
exclusive.
is.
And my sense that the reactions on that
Yeah, when his
probably
southern
vary.
comes out, he probably doesn't
I
really
think
want
I saw another hand. Yes.
Yes. Okay. You're getting close. All right. Here we go. Of course.
Jennifer Denton points out that adaptive leadership, which is a key piece of that KLC framework, that's a broad concept, right? But every day, today, tomorrow, the next day, we are confronted with smaller, more technical kinds of leadership.
I don't know. It just has
That's
this
okay too.
show. It was in David Cordell's email with all the things. Okay, well, I can print it off and bring it down to you here. Okay. Oh, it's fine. Okay. I get back.
The point there was that the broad concept of adaptive leadership is really implying a different way of thinking and a cultural change. To understand the difference between that and the more technical kinds of decision making and leading. And the fact that adaptive leadership is something that's practiced, that can be practiced by everyone in an organization. It is not attached to positions and roles and specific assignments. Other thoughts on this one? All right, I think the committee has something to think about there. Next slide, please. We're moving on to goal 3. I would point out for you that the strikeout language here about the state's goals for public higher education, that language referred to the Kansas Board of Regents strategic plan. That's fine, but the problem is that not everyone is familiar with the Kansas Board of Regents strategic plan. And if you're not, then if you read that goal in and of itself, it doesn't necessarily mean anything to you. So the intent here is to state directly what it is we're talking about. The question is, how do you assess ready for life?
Okay.
That was an interesting response. It was, well, no, it was interesting because the answer that we heard just then was, well, you don't necessarily assess goals, that's the aspirational thing, right? But you do assess objectives. So maybe we need an objective that addresses the ready for life thing. Myra. the suggestion there is that the importance of language like life and career is that it needs to suggest something that goes beyond a job. Oh. It was just suggested that particularly if you look at general education and other parts of our curriculum, we do in fact teach and assess things having to do with overall life wellness and civic engagement. Okay. Art appreciation, many other things that are within that gen ed framework, trying to keep track of hands. Tonya. That was a reminder that you can't just look at individual objectives. Sometimes you have to step back and see how it fits the rest of the plan. And the example offered was that migrated language that we saw a little while ago. You know, about what was the way that ended, Tonya? The language that we. There we go. Yeah, that they graduate with the skills and habits of mind necessary to go out and live good lives, essentially. Lynn.
But also we have to remember that there's strategies that all of us within our department have responsibility to create. So the goal itself, talking about ready for life, is what strategies in our unit are we going to focus on that are going to address that? And then I think it's at the strategy and the objective level that we then begin to say, yes, we were able to assess that ready for life.
Another good reminder there that when we talk about the plan, we talk primarily about goals and strategies, but goals and objectives, but each unit has strategies. That's where the real work happens. And the strategies that fill in under this are, it's necessary for them to be very much measurable. Other thoughts about this one? Let's move on to the next slide. Still with objective 3, or excuse me, goal 3. Objective 3 is a new one. My only comment about this new one is this is another opportunity to take the ideals of goal 5, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and integrate them into the rest of the plan. Questions or comments? Hearing none, we'll move on to goal 4. You see here on this slide 2 language changes. I think it's accurate to say that in both cases, it's, again, an attempt to be a little more direct with the language. What are your thoughts?
Aside, I know there are ones who are faculty and staff that are on the committee, but were there just people on the committee who were just alumni?
The question was, were there any members of the review committee who are alumni but not current employees of the university? No, there were not. All 9 members of the committee are ESU faculty and staff. The question, who wants to know?
No, the question is why. There seems to be an alum focus in this goal and the objectives, and I think that a dedicated alumni voice would be important to hold these objectives.
The point of the question was simply that given the focus of some of what we're seeing, an alumnus or an alumna might have been helpful to us in terms of focusing this. Amy. The point there was that Tyler Curtis with the Alumni Association was one of our consultants that we worked with. I'll just add too, it just came to my mind, at the very end of our session today, when I tell you about next steps and what else is going on, I'll have some information about other constituent groups that we're going to be talking with. Okay, that was the same point I think that Tonya wanted to make. Yes. It's a question about language there. As to why in Objective 3, we're using that language, the Hornet experience, whereas elsewhere it's been much more consistent that we refer to Emporia State University, you know, a different kind of tone to it. Would that be fair to say? Please. Could I ask you to hang on to that one for a second, because I want to see if there's an answer to that question that's kind of hanging out there. Jennifer?
I don't know, but I love it. I think the Hornet try still in our students. I would say, first of all, I would say the goal is not about the alumni coming to rescue us. It is our responsibility to do that for ourselves. But if we engage our alumni friends and add value to the Hornet experience, that pride and that connection. We talk about Hornet, that's the spirit. I like it.
The comment there was that the advantage of a term like Hornet experience is that it speaks to a pride and an attitude about being a part of the group. Yes, please. I hope you haven't forgotten your question. Mm-hmm. the question there, if I captured it properly, is that you see objective 1, implement the campus master plan. Well, isn't that also a plan that was separately developed from the strategic plan? Yes.
So the campus master plan is about the infrastructure, which has to feed in to undergirding our overall. That it talks about technology, buildings, renovations, additions, things that will hopefully feed in, and then some of those other strategies that go in this. So they are very well connected. How to separate may send us in different directions. And it's our plan. It's available on the website, different than in Puerto Rico, which is a higher end. I don't know. It's about, it still supports this one. It's an objective that our administrative side, along with academic side,
So the response just then is about the campus master plan being about infrastructure that's necessary to sustain everything else in the plan. Tonya. So the point there, or at least part of it, being that if sustainability is what we're after, then infrastructure, campus master plan has to be a part of that, and it has to be long-term. Jim.
I know this is going to shock everybody. I keep thinking that objective 2 is objective 1, and then everything flows.
Mm.
It strategically develops and align the resources to the university priorities against the master plan, etc. So I would just suggest that you think about flip-flopping 1 and 2.
This is interesting because we we did have this conversation, and it was a very good one. The point that was just made: strategically develop and align resources with priorities. The observation there was that is really maybe the overriding idea of this whole goal. That perhaps it should come first in the objectives and other things should fall under it, or maybe that's the language that the goal itself should even be using. Jim, am I okay? Now, it was pointed out that maybe one of the downsides of that is that the innovation part gets a little bit lost or de-emphasized if you do it that way. Mark?
Objective 3 and objective 5, and how why were they placed under this goal, and how placing them under this goal makes
Question there was objective 3, and we'll get to 5 in a second. Is placement under this goal even the right place for it? Is there maybe a different place you're asking where it would be more?
I'm not sure where it might go, so I'm not going to put that into my question, but I am going to say, is
Is it limiting to put it under this goal? And you know, before anybody attempts to answer that, I would just, it's an obvious reminder, but I'll offer it. When you look at objective 1, which we were just now talking about, and objective 3 that we're talking about now, those are the original ones. You know, this was the plan as it was written 5 years ago. Sometimes it can be a little bit hard to reconstruct exactly what the thinking was. But anyway, anyone have a thought about Mark's question?
Maybe I can add an example. Suppose that we bring an alumnus on campus to a class. That's a great example of objective 3, but it really doesn't fit under goal 4, does it?
If we bring an alum to campus to speak and work with students, maybe that doesn't seem to fit so much under goal 4, but maybe it fits under goal 3, you say.
No,
Oh, I'm sorry.
An example of objective 3.
Objective 3.
An objective example of objective 3, but it really doesn't, it's not innovative and it's not growth. It's possible it could be, but I'm creating an example where you bring a, you know, there's nothing particularly innovative about bringing a speaker into a classroom. It's a great experience, but is it a part of goal 4? That's the idea behind why I'm asking, is objective 3, are we limiting it by placing it under goal 4?
Are we limiting objective 3 by putting it under goal 4?
Well, my thought was maybe it belongs under curriculum, but maybe that would be limiting it in another direction. So I'm not sure what.
That example might actually show that that would be a way to develop an aligned resource for university priorities. Our alumni are a resource. Their experiences are resources.
So the thinking in maybe in defense of having objective 3 where it is that alumni and friends are in a sense resources. So as alumni help us keep those connections between alumni and current students, that could be an element of sustainability. Let's move on to the next slide. Still under goal 4. And this is the last one. You will see old objective 5 is struck. The old objective 5 functioned as a kind of catch-all category when the plan was initially developed. And I guess it did serve a purpose there because some strategies have fallen in under old objective 5. On the other hand, it seems so broad and non-specific that I think it was a little difficult for folks to translate into something specific. New objective 5. Well, the idea here is that we can and should do a better job of using information to make good decisions. What do you think? Hearing no questions or comments. Oh, there is one. the question there, or the comment, was that while the overall intent seems fine, there's terminology there that might not be clear and familiar to everyone, such as terms like data governance, comprehensive data information systems. I hear silence, but I see nods. Joanne? Yeah, the question has to do, again, with that term, shared data governance, and exactly what it's getting at. Shelley? So the idea that there is a data warehouse, if you will, that's accessible to everyone, that we're able to go to it, get the information and reports that we need, and have it readily accessible to us. Yes, Diana.
Use, utilize data to inform decisions. That's really what we need to be doing. And then talking about coordination, the data definitions and data sources across campus, the strategy under that.
The question there was, would we be better off in the objective to just simply state something along the lines of utilize data to inform good decisions, or something along those lines, and then leave the specific initiatives around data governance, data information systems, to the strategies underneath? Terry. Yeah, that comment was about some of the questions that's raised by these language that I'm sure we'll have to grapple with. If you have a unit at the university that has a data system for its own purposes, well, is that okay? Does it all need to be centralized somehow? Questions like that. Yes, Sheila. The comment there, I'll try to boil it down. The language as it's suggested, it raises a lot of questions that we don't have an answer to. The example being student information, FERPA, security? Are we talking about just internal decision making? Well, fine, that's one thing, but you know, the risk of data being shared inappropriately is a concern. Jim.
Maybe there might be a couple of strategies in that objective that could pop down as strategies. But the general sense is of looking at this, I'm getting the sense of create a data decision-making culture.
The comment there was that one suspects that the real idea is or should be to create a culture and a mindset among us where we're going to use data and use information to help us make good decisions, and that everything else is kind of subservient to that, right? You know, I guess one of my concerns about objective as the committee has drafted it, hey, we tried, but you know, I told this story yesterday when Shane and I met with the Chamber of Commerce Board to share this information and get their input. You know, you want your goals and objectives to be so clear in their language, you know, in presenting a single idea in a way that cannot be mistaken. I heard a politician say recently, if you're explaining, you're losing. And if, you know, if we write a goal or objective in such a way that you have to sit a person down and talk to them for 10 minutes before they understand it, that's probably not a well-written objective. So we'll give this some thought as to maybe a clearer way to get at what we're saying there. Other comments or questions about this slide? Next slide, please. All right, what I would like to do, before I open it up for any parting comments or suggestions or concerns, let me tell you a little bit about what we think is coming next. This is the first of 3 campus forums, as you know. The committee is going to be gathering input through the end of this semester. So the first thing I would offer is if you have suggestions after this meeting, maybe something that comes to mind later, or maybe that you just didn't want to bring up for discussion today, please feel very free to send those thoughts to me by email. You can email me at dcordle, that's D-C-O-R-D-L-E, @emporia.edu. Anytime between now and May 11th, which is commencement Saturday. I'm afraid to turn around and see if that was captured. Oh, well. So yeah, we're continuing to get input. In addition to these 3 campus forums, we're also meeting with the alumni board. We're going to be meeting with the foundation board. We'll talk with supporters. We are seeking input from community members as well. I think that once the semester ends and we've kind of stopped getting input, the committee will try to gather and compile and consider the feedback we've gotten. We'll likely need to do some revisions based on this input. We'll package that up, send it to President Garrett as recommendations then from the committee. Looking beyond that, I would anticipate that in the fall, the revised goals and objectives will be shared out. At that point, all areas of the university will be asked to consider adjusting their strategies in response to the revised goals and objectives. So that's just a little bit about what the committee thinks will be happening next. So with that, we've got a little extra time. I would invite any comments or thoughts you might have, whether they be specific or broad. Yes? The question there was, did goal 3 contain specific language that refers to graduate on time? That was the question, June? It did not, as far as I know, although if you look further down in strategies, I believe you do see that language. Shelley. Question there is about, you know, the interface between the strategic plan and the campus master plan. How does one inform the other? The example given, you can look at ACEs, where in order to achieve some of what we've just looked at, they're going to have some infrastructure needs there that flip back to the campus master plan, right? What say you, Diana?
Kind of same plan. We're going to be drafting right now. We're kind of something like that would be embodied probably in a broader way than like repurposing about that if we need to, or it doesn't flow like this in terms of strategy.
Yeah.
Specific projects, if you will, or specific so we would be drafting a report here also in May, and we finalize that this fall.
Campus plan also then is engaging in a process not identical to this one, but it might very well experience some revision, and crosstalk is possible. Ed. Oh, thank you. Thank you. I think the main point there is we should feel good that this is not a plan that's been sitting on a shelf for 5 years, which many of us have had that experience before. Shane.
David, I might just add one thing. Actually, Shelley can make me think about it. You know, as this thing progresses, wherever it goes, what I in front of, kind of tweaks we make, eventually we'll go back to the strategy level, and that strategy is where the rubber meets the road and such. But I don't want, or the committee doesn't want everybody to think that there was a certain unit that's in charge of a certain objective or strategy, but that's where it will ultimately land in the end. Now maybe that is where the majority of the land. But the way that this is framed, in the lens that the committee looked at it, is this is the university. So how do we as a campus actually look up every one of these objective strategies? Michelle, your area in particular reminded me of that. So though you may lead a good majority of it, this is our campus plan strategy.
Great reminder that while strategies are proposed and carried out by units, the intent and hope is that we've got goals and objectives that can be broadly shared by all units. That's a good point. Enrollment management is likely to be the source of a lot of the data and information that would guide our decisions. Okay. Other thoughts? Yes, sir. I think the answer is yes. The question was about the technology we're using today, and might we see more of it in other public meetings and hearings? I hope so. I will tell you, I'm certainly not the best person to answer that, because this is my first experience using anything like this. Anything else before we adjourn? Thank you all. Have a good day and a good end to your semester.